In March 1994, a 44-year-old botanist named David Trigger stood at the edge of 800 hectares of exhausted cattle country in Queensland's Gulf Savannah and told the station manager he was going to stop fighting the prickly acacia. He would not spray it. He would not chain it. He would not ring bark it. He would not hire contractors to rip it out by machine. He would let every thorny, dusty acre of it stand exactly where it was, and he would watch what happened next. The station manager's response was not recorded, but the regional land management officer's letter arrived 3 weeks later. It called the idea reckless and environmentally irresponsible. It said the prickly acacia would engulf the open woodland within 8 years and render the landscape permanently uninhabitable for native fauna. It said that anyone who had spent more than a week in western Queensland knew that this species, once established, was a one-way door. 31 years later, the area David Trigger refused to clear is 1,400 hectares of recovering savanna woodland, 29 species of native birds documented in transect surveys, 11 native grass species reestablished where exotic pasture grasses had been the only ground cover, and a case study that ecologists from the CSIRO continue to cite when arguing about what restoration in dry tropical Australia actually looks like. And the prickly acacia is retreating, not because anyone is cutting it, because the woodland beneath it decided it had served its purpose. This is the story of one of the most contested ecological experiments in northern Australia's history, and the reason the botanist who ran it never once called what he did restoration. The land David Trigger walked into in 1994 was not simply degraded. It was caught in a cycle that each management intervention made slightly worse. And the frustrating part, the part that made the land management officer's letters so confident, was that the interventions were technically correct. The species they were trying to eliminate was genuinely damaging. The methods they were using were genuinely capable of killing it. The problem was not the competence of the people running the program. The problem was that removing the acacia was the wrong move at the wrong moment in a process that the management framework could not see because it had never been asked to look for it. Prickly acacia, Vachellia nilotica, had arrived in Queensland in the 1920s as a fodder plant. Graziers in the Channel Country had been told it would provide shade and dry season feed for cattle during drought. The logic made a kind of surface-level sense. The species had been used in that role across parts of South Asia and East Africa for generations. What nobody appears to have asked at the time was whether the ecological conditions in those places had anything in common with the conditions in Queensland's tropical savanna, or whether the bird and mammal communities that suppress acacia regeneration in its native range existed in any form on this continent. They did not. Within 2 decades of introduction, prickly acacia had become the thing every land manager in western and central Queensland feared most. It spread along creek lines first, using floodwaters to carry its pods downstream and then outward from those corridors into open woodland, where it formed thickets dense enough to exclude virtually all understory growth and most grazing value. The Queensland government had been funding prickly acacia control programs since the 1970s. By the time Trigger arrived at his study site, the official control toolkit included aerial herbicide application, mechanical removal using chains dragged between bulldozers, individual plant injection with concentrated herbicide, and biocontrol research still years away from producing anything useful in the field. Landholders were legally required under the Land Protection Act to control the species on their properties. Non-compliance carried fines. The default management posture was permanent war, and it had been that way for 20 years without any measurable reduction in the total prickly acacia footprint across the state. Before any of that matters, you need to understand what the Gulf Savannah was supposed to look like. Before European settlement, the country running inland from the Gulf of Carpentaria was open eucalyptus woodland, coolibah, and yapunya along the drainage lines, ironwood and gidgee on the drier rises, with a native grass understory that supported the largest population of plains, wanderers, bustards, and grass-dependent songbirds on the continent. By 1994, roughly 85% of that native grass understory had been replaced by introduced species across the region. The native tree density outside formerly protected areas had declined to somewhere between 10% and 20% of pre-European cover. The only meaningful native tree recruitment anyone had documented in the previous 30 years was happening inside the prickly acacia, and nobody in the management system had asked why. Trigger had spent the previous decade doing something the Queensland land management system had not formally asked anyone to do. He had been mapping what was actually living under the prickly acacia. Not the acacia itself, not the cattle, not the introduced grasses that had replaced native pasture communities across most of the Gulf lowlands. He had been cataloging the native seedlings establishing in the shade below the acacia canopy, and the numbers had been consistent enough across multiple sites that he had stopped treating them as anomalies. Ironwood, Yapunya, Kulaba, Gidgee, Bauhinia. Species that had been functionally absent from the open paddock for 70 years were turning up regularly in the understory of established prickly acacia thickets. Not in one location, not in one season, but across sites, across rainfall zones, across soil types. He needed to understand why they were there and nowhere else. The answer involved a form of ecological logic that the control programs had never been designed to consider. Prickly acacia, like most acacias, is a nitrogen fixer. It pulls atmospheric nitrogen through its root system and deposits it into a soil profile that a century of cattle grazing had stripped to a chemically impoverished state. In bare paddock country, soil nitrogen levels on surveyed sites had declined to the point where native tree seedlings could not access the nutrients needed for their first 2 seasons of growth, even when seeds were present. The acacia was rebuilding the soil chemistry that native trees required to establish. But what mattered even more than the nitrogen on this landscape was shade and physical structure. The native woodland trees Trigger was finding, the kulaba, the yapunya, the ironwood, are not pioneer species. They cannot establish in bare ground under full sun in a landscape where feral goats and cattle are grazing every seedling as it emerges from the soil. What they require is a nurse plant, a structure that holds large grazing animals back, that reduces surface soil temperature enough for germination to succeed, and that buys the seedling 3 to 4 years of protected growth before it is large enough to survive browsing pressure on its own. Prickly acacia, with its interlocking thorn architecture and a canopy dense enough to make the interior effectively impassable to livestock, was providing exactly that for free. The control programs, every single one of them, were removing the only shelter in which native tree recruitment was occurring at any measurable rate on that landscape. Trigger published the observations across a series of papers through the mid-1990s, working through the University of Queensland and later through collaborative programs with CSIRO's Tropical Ecosystems Research Center in Darwin. The responses from the land management community ranged from polite skepticism to outright hostility. One submission to a Queensland Natural Resources Department review stated plainly that Trigger's findings were ecologically interesting but operationally irrelevant, because the alternative he appeared to be suggesting, leaving prickly acacia in place, would expand the infestation beyond any recoverable boundary. The concern was not unreasonable. Prickly acacia produces pods in volumes that are difficult to describe without sounding like an exaggeration. A single mature tree can shed 4,000 pods in a single growing season, each pod containing 6 to 8 viable seeds. The seeds pass through cattle intact and remain viable after digestion. In the wet season, floodwaters carry pods along creek lines across hundreds of kilometers of channel country. On a property without grazing management, pod density on the ground after a wet season event can reach several hundred per square meter in the vicinity of established trees. Leaving any established population in place was, by every predictive model the department had been running, mathematically equivalent to seeding the surrounding watershed. What those models had not been built to consider was the behavior of prickly acacia's own seedlings in the shade of a closed canopy. Trigger had been measuring this specifically. Prickly acacia is an obligate full-sun species at the seedling stage. Its seeds germinate readily enough in any moist soil, but the seedlings cannot survive more than a few weeks without direct light reaching the ground. Under a closed prickly acacia canopy, prickly acacia seedlings do not persist beyond their first month. The thicket does not expand from its interior, it expands from its edges where paddock light reaches the ground beneath the outermost plants. And on a site where grazing animals had been excluded, those edges were the only places where new acacia was recruiting. The interior of any thicket older than 10 years was self-limiting. Meanwhile, in that same interior, native seedlings brought in by birds and wind were coming up through the leaf litter and growing steadily toward gaps in the canopy as the older acacia trees began to fail. The oldest prickly acacia on the study site, trees established in the 1950s and 1960s were beginning to show structural decline. When they fell, the native canopy below them was positioned to take the space. Not immediately, not visibly, but the process was directional, and for the first time, Trigger had a data set long enough to measure it. What no one on either side of the argument had been able to answer was what happened to a prickly acacia thicket after 40 uninterrupted years. The control programs had been applied so consistently across Queensland since the 1970s that there was almost nowhere in the state where you could find a thicket old enough to test the question. Most infestations were repeatedly knocked back before they reached the age at which Trigger's succession hypothesis predicted they would begin to fail. Trigger's site was one of the few exceptions in the survey record, because it had been regarded for over a decade as a practical write-off, too steep along the creek margins to chain economically, too remote to spray on a viable aerial contract, too dense for individual plant injection to be worth the labor cost. It had been left not by ecological design, but by the gradual accumulation of land managers deciding the effort was not worth the return. That accidental neglect, the same neglect that had been treated as a failure of compliance, had produced the data Trigger needed to make an argument that the standard framework had no category for. In 1997, the study site expanded when an adjoining pastoral lease came up for reassignment, and Trigger, working through a conservation tenure arrangement brokered with the Queensland Department of Environment, secured management rights over a further 600 hectares of country running down to the creek system's main channel. This was not a simple administrative process. The neighboring leaseholder, a cattle operation whose family had been running that country for 3 generations, formally objected on the grounds that leaving prickly acacia uncontrolled on a conservation tenure constituted a legal biosecurity hazard to every property downstream. The objection was valid under Queensland legislation. The case was examined by the Land Protection Tribunal in 1998. Trigger attended and presented the seedling density transects he had been maintaining since 1994, site photographs taken from fixed monitoring points across 4 years, and the soil chemistry data showing nitrogen accumulation under established acacia canopy. The tribunal found in favor of the conservation tenure arrangement with conditions. A managed buffer zone along every shared fence line would be maintained under standard prickly acacia control protocols at the reserve's expense. The interior was Trigger's to manage as the data directed. Trigger also needed to deal with feral animals in the reserve's interior, and the scale of the problem was considerable. The previous leaseholder had managed cattle numbers through periodic mustering, which had kept the overall grazing pressure within the range the land could absorb, but had done nothing about the feral goat population that had been building in the creekside country since the early 1980s. Goats are a different category of problem from cattle in country like this. A goat can stand on its hind legs to browse material 1.5 meters off the ground. It will strip bark. It will eat seed heads before they fall. It will work through a gorse thicket or an acacia understory systematically in a way that cattle generally will not, because cattle have preferences about thorns that goats largely do not share. The reserve's feral goat population at the time management changed hands was estimated at somewhere between 200 and 300 individuals. Removing them was the first and most expensive thing Trigger did. It took 3 years of coordinated mustering and targeted removal before the population was low enough to stop suppressing native seedling survival in the reserve's interior. The years between 1998 and 2005 were, by every external appearance, a period in which nothing was working, and the skeptics were being proven correct in real time. The acacia thickets looked unchanged from the road. The outermost edges continued to expand into any open ground within reach of the existing canopy, exactly as the department's models had predicted. Aerial surveys commissioned by the department and applied across the broader region showed the prickly acacia footprint on the reserve still increasing in total area through 2001, holding roughly stable through 2003, and then in 2004 and 2005, contracting for the first time in the recorded survey history of that country. An extended dry period across the Gulf Savannah had pushed the oldest acacia individuals on the site past their water stress tolerance. Not a landscape-wide drought severe enough to kill native seedlings, which are adapted to Queensland's rainfall variability across decades, but severe enough to accelerate senescence in prickly acacia trees that were already past their productive peak. In the wet season following the dry, Trigger walked the interior of the reserve and counted fallen acacia stems across his established transects. Then he counted the native canopy trees moving into the gaps. The leaseholder next door, the family that had opposed the conservation tenure in 1997, watched what happened to the interior of the reserve during those years from their shared fence line. In a recorded interview published through a CSIRO outreach program in 2011, the leaseholder described walking the boundary in 2006 and seeing trees on the reserve side of the fence that he had not seen anywhere else on that country since he was a child. He said he had assumed the acacia die-off would leave open ground that would recruit a new generation of acacia in the following wet. What he found instead was that the native trees, which had been growing through the understory for over a decade, were already large enough to claim the canopy space that the dying acacias were releasing. He described it as a slow-motion handover that he had not believed was possible until he was standing inside it. He said the strangest part was that the trees he was looking at were the trees that were supposed to be there, not the ones that had been arriving for the last 70 years. By 2009, Trigger's survey data had accumulated to a point where the pattern was no longer dependent on how you interpreted individual transects. The core of the reserve, the area that had been under closed prickly acacia canopy continuously since the early 1960s, was now carrying a native overstory density that had no equivalent in any survey record of that landscape type for that region going back to the earliest pastoral records. Coolibah trees with trunk diameters indicating a minimum age of 15 to 20 years were present at densities the open paddock adjacent to the reserve could not approach by any measure. The native grass community under those trees, spinifex recruits and native Mitchell grass establishing in ground that had been dominated by introduced buffel grass and paragrass since the 1980s, was increasing in cover across each successive survey year. The change was not uniform. It followed the age structure of the acacia, oldest thickets recovering fastest, younger ones still functioning as nurse canopy for seedlings not yet large enough to compete for light. The trajectory was clear. The timescale was longer than any single management program in Queensland's history had been asked to sustain. The feral animal removal work never stopped. Goats were excluded through a combination of boundary fencing and systematic mustering operations that ran across multiple years before the population inside the reserve was reduced to the point where individual animal removal became practical. Feral pigs, which root up native grass recruits and disturb the seedbed in ways that can reset a decade of native succession in a single wet season, were controlled through coordinated baiting programs on a rotating schedule. Feral cattle incursions through fence damage were identified and repaired within days, rather than allowing weeks of browsing to accumulate in areas where native seedlings were establishing. All of that required a management presence and a budget discipline that was consistently close to the edge of what the reserve could sustain. But none of it was tree planting. None of it was broadcasting native seed. None of it was earthworks or topsoil reconstruction or any of the active intervention approaches that formal restoration programs were applying at comparable sites across northern Queensland. Every available dollar went to fencing and feral animal control. And the ecological rationale was precisely the same rationale the acacia thickets had been demonstrating for 2 decades without anyone in the management framework recognizing it. Stop the things that eat seedlings. The seedlings will handle the rest. The results, as peer-reviewed data rather than anecdote, are specific enough to stand in plain language. Native bird transect surveys across the reserve's interior between 2010 and 2023 documented 29 species, including woodland specialists that had not appeared in any ornithological survey record for that landscape going back to the 1940s. The rainbow bee-eater, the white-winged triller, the striated pardalote, and in one survey along the main creek line, the hooded parrot, all recorded in a landscape that the 1994 aerial photography shows as open degraded pasture carrying a few isolated remnant trees along the watercourses. Native grass ground cover in the reserve's interior has increased from 4% in Trigger's baseline 1994 survey to 38% in the most recent ground-truthed measurement, with individual survey quadrats in the areas of most complete acacia canopy collapse showing values above 60%. Prickly acacia now covers approximately 31% of the reserve's total area compared to 68% at its surveyed peak in 2001. The species is not eliminated. It may never be eliminated at this site or at any site in Queensland. but its functional role in the system has shifted from a uniform closed canopy that prevented native recruitment to a patchy, heterogeneous structure in different stages of collapse, still providing nurse plant function in some zones, retreating in others, and in the oldest zones, gone entirely, and replaced by the woodland it was incubating for 40 years. The neighboring leaseholder has not made a public statement comparing management outcomes on his side of the fence to outcomes on the reserve side, but he has, at least twice, contacted the researchers working with Trigger's dataset to ask specific questions about feral animal control methodology and timing. Those questions received detailed answers. What was also noted, without anyone framing it as a criticism, was that the feral animal control program on the reserve had cost substantially less per hectare per year over the life of the project than the mechanical and chemical prickly acacia control program running on comparable land on the neighboring lease. The native tree canopy was denser on the reserve. The costs had been lower. The outcome had not matched any model the department had produced in 30 years of running control programs. Nobody officially described that as a problem with the models. David Trigger is 74 years old. He remains affiliated with the University of Queensland. He continues to participate in transect surveys on the reserve when the wet season and the condition of the access track permit, which in Gulf country means that roughly 4 months of each year the reserve is effectively inaccessible by any vehicle. Trigger does not appear to regard this as an operational problem. The reserve manages itself for those 4 months in roughly the same way it managed itself for the 40 years before anyone paid attention to what it was doing. The most recent paper carrying his name as co-author on the reserve's long-term dataset appeared in 2022, examining the statistical relationship between prickly acacia canopy, senescence rate, and native overstory recruitment density across a 28-year continuous time series. The paper's conclusions were carefully worded in the manner that peer-reviewed ecological work is required to be carefully worded. It stated that the data supported the hypothesis that allowing naturalistic successional processes to operate within degraded savanna woodland, rather than interrupting those processes through repeated mechanical and chemical intervention, produced higher rates of native tree recruitment over decadal timescales than control and replant approaches recorded at comparable sites in the published literature. It stated that the finding had implications for how prickly acacia management policy in Queensland was framed at the landscape scale. It did not recommend that anyone stop clearing. It said the question of when to clear and when to leave was more complicated than the existing regulatory framework acknowledged, and that the complexity deserved to be formally built into that framework rather than managed around it by individual landholders working in isolation. There is a photograph from a fixed monitoring position on a low ridge above the reserve's main creek channel, taken in August 1994. It shows open sky above the camera, bare red soil at the feet of the monitoring post, scattered tussocks of introduced buffel grass across the foreground, and a solid wall of prickly acacia canopy sealing off the creek corridor behind. The same monitoring position was photographed again in August 2022. The 2022 image shows a closed canopy of Coolabah and Yapunya reaching above the upper frame of the photograph, a native grass understory covering the full foreground and the creek corridor behind it, only partially visible through the density of vegetation now growing between the camera and the water. The prickly acacia that fills the 1994 frame is not present in the 2022 frame in any form that can be identified. Not controlled, not sprayed, not chained or injected or aerially treated. Just replaced over 28 years by the woodland that was forming underneath it in the dark, waiting for the conditions to be right. Nothing was planted between those two photographs. No seed was dispersed by hand across that ridge. No restoration contractor worked that ground. No program budget paid for a single tree on that hillside. The only thing that happened there, across nearly 3 decades, was the removal of the animals that were eating the seedlings. Everything else arrived on its own terms, in its own time, according to a logic that had been operating on that country for thousands of years before anyone arrived to interrupt it. If a story like this changes how you think about what land can do when you stop fighting it, subscribe. One of these goes up every week. Like the video if it was worth your time.